The first thing my son-in-law said at Thanksgiving dinner was loud enough to carry across the entire table. Honestly, Carol, your father has been living off your goodwill for 3 years now. At some point, a retired beat cop with a government pension becomes a liability, not a guest. You could hear the refrigerator humming after that. My daughter set down her fork very carefully, the way people do when they're deciding something. My grandson, 7 years old, stopped chewing his roll and looked at me with wide eyes like he was waiting to see if I'd cry or disappear. I didn't do either. I just looked at my son-in-law, a man named Brent who wore fleece vests indoors and had never once in his life had to tell someone their child wasn't coming home. And I picked up my coffee cup slowly. Then I looked across the table at the man sitting beside him. Carol's neighbor, the one she'd invited last minute because his wife was visiting family in Phoenix. The one who had been very quiet up until that moment. His name was Douglas Avery. I hadn't seen him in 19 years, and from the expression that crossed his face the second our eyes met, I understood that Douglas Avery hadn't forgotten me, either. He put his napkin on the table slowly. Brent was still talking about liability and self-sufficiency, and the importance of financial independence in retirement when Douglas looked at him and said, quietly, but completely without invitation, "You have no idea who you're sitting across from." Brent blinked. "Excuse me?" "That man," Douglas said, nodding toward me, "carried me out of a burning building." The refrigerator kept humming. Outside, wind moved through the oaks in the front yard. My daughter looked at me like I was someone she'd only thought she knew. And I just sat there at the Thanksgiving table in my son-in-law's expensive house, feeling 64 years of my life settle around me, like a coat I hadn't taken off in a long time. To explain how we got there, I need to back up a bit. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 4 kids in a house, where my father worked the line at a GM plant, and my mother kept the books for a dry cleaner 2 blocks away. Nobody in my family had gone to college. Nobody expected to. What we expected was work, and we expected it to be hard and honest, and we expected to do it without making a fuss about it. I joined the Dayton Police Department at 23. Not because I had some dramatic calling, more because the plant had layoffs the summer I graduated, and the department was hiring, and my Uncle Jerry said it was steady work with good benefits and a pension you could count on. Turned out he was right about all of it. I spent 31 years on the job. Patrol for the first 12, then detective work after that. Homicide eventually. People ask what homicide is like, and I never know exactly how to answer, because the honest version takes longer than most conversations allow. The short version is this. You learn very quickly that grief is the only emotion that never fully leaves a room, even after everyone in it has gone home. I married Carol's mother, Elaine, in 1987. We met at a 4th of July cookout at my partner's house. She was a school teacher, 3rd grade, small woman with dark hair, and a habit of finishing other people's sentences correctly. Not rudely, just because she was paying attention. I liked that about her immediately. We had Carol in 1990. 2 years later, Elaine was diagnosed with MS. I won't spend long on what the years after that looked like because they're not the point of this story. And also because some things belong to a man privately. What I'll say is that I worked the night shift for 9 of the 14 years. Elaine needed serious care because the department differential paid an extra $4 an hour, and we needed every dollar. I learned to cook dinner at 6 in the morning before sleeping. I learned which pharmacy stayed open late and which home health aides actually showed up on time. I learned that love, real love, the kind that doesn't show up in greeting cards, mostly looks like someone setting an alarm and getting up anyway. Elaine died in the spring of 2017. Carol held her hand at the end. I held the other one. Retirement came 14 months later, because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and the department had a buyout offer. I couldn't afford to refuse. Things changed after that. The house in Dayton felt very large. Carol had moved to Charlotte 6 years earlier with Brent, who worked in commercial real estate and wore button-down shirts with the cuffs rolled precisely halfway up. They had a nice house in a nice suburb and a son named Owen, who liked dinosaurs and YouTube videos about trains. I visited when I could, every few months, then more often, after a minor cardiac scare in 2019 that turned out to be nothing serious but scared Carol badly enough that she asked me to consider moving closer. So I did. Rented a small apartment in a complex 20 minutes from their house. Simple place. One bedroom, a parking space, a balcony that faced the wrong direction for sunsets, but caught the morning light reasonably well. Brent never said outright that he found my presence inconvenient. He was too well dressed for outright statements, but he had a way of referencing my pension in conversation, always with a small pause before the word pension, as if the word itself needed special handling. As if a government retirement after 31 years on the job was something slightly embarrassing, like a coupon you had to explain to the cashier. Carol loved me. I knew that. But Carol also loved her husband, and she'd built a life with him, and watching your father get smaller in someone else's house is a particular kind of uncomfortable that I understood even when it hurt. For 3 years, I navigated it quietly. Helped with Owen when I could. Fixed things in the garage when Brent wasn't home. Ate dinner with them on Sundays and kept my stories short, and avoided the topic of the job entirely because Brent had a habit of finding ways to segue from law enforcement into politics in a way that never ended pleasantly. I was becoming an expert at taking up less space. Then came Thanksgiving. I remember the exact moment Brent started talking. Carol had just brought out the sweet potato casserole, and Douglas was in the middle of a polite story about his daughter's college applications when Brent set down his wine glass and said what he said. The table went quiet, the way tables go quiet when someone has said a true thing badly or a false thing confidently. People weren't sure which kind of quiet it was yet. I was looking at my plate when I heard Douglas put his napkin down. I hadn't connected the name when Carol introduced us an hour earlier. Douglas Avery, her neighbor, pleasant guy. His wife was out of town. I'd shaken his hand and moved on. But the moment he said what he said, I looked up and then I saw him. Not the silver-haired man in his late 50s sitting at my daughter's table, but the 39-year-old man I'd pulled off the 3rd floor of a warehouse on Benchley Road in 2004. Different face, same eyes. Brent frowned. What does that mean? A burning building. Douglas was looking at me steadily. It means exactly what I said, Dad. Carol's voice was careful. Old memories, I said. But Douglas wasn't finished. He turned to Brent with the particular calm of a man who has decided something and isn't going to be talked out of it. I owe this man my life, he said, and I think you should know who you're dismissing. Brent opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I wasn't dismissing anyone. You called him a liability. The word landed the second time harder than the first. Brent set his fork down. Carol looked at her husband with an expression I recognized from growing up. The one that meant she was deciding how much she believed someone. Owen took another bite of his roll and watched all of us with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that dinner tables can be complicated. I looked out the dining room window at the dark yard and thought about Benchley Road. November of 2004. Cold snap, first real one of the season. A textile storage warehouse on the east side of Dayton, vacant for 2 years, had been used by a pair of brothers running a wire stripping operation. They'd pulled copper wiring for months, piled the stripped insulation in rooms they weren't using. On a Tuesday night in November, a faulty space heater and a room full of synthetic insulation shavings made a decision on their own. By the time my partner Yvonne and I responded to assist on the perimeter call, the building was going hard on the upper floors. We were supposed to be backup. Crowd management, keep people back. Then the fire captain got a report that someone might be on the 3rd floor. A tenant in the adjacent building had seen a light in the window earlier that evening. Possibly a squatter, possibly no one. The uncertainty was exactly the wrong kind. The fire crew was working the east stairwell. The west stairwell was compromised. The captain was rerouting. I don't entirely know what made me go in. 31 years later, I'm still not sure whether it was instinct or stupidity or simply the fact that I had been a cop long enough to know that possibly no one has a way of being someone. I went in through a ground floor window with a wet rag over my face and a radio that cut out on the 2nd landing. The 3rd floor was full of smoke, but not yet fully involved. I worked the rooms fast, calling out, getting nothing back. I was about to turn when I heard coughing behind a closed door at the far end. Douglas Avery had been up there going through paperwork. He'd rented a small storage unit from the original owner 3 years earlier and hadn't been notified of the sale. He'd come after work to retrieve some documents, gotten disoriented when the smoke filled the stairwell, and barricaded himself in a back office because he thought the door would hold the air. He was on his knees when I found him. Getting him down the west stairwell without a clear exit took longer than I want to remember. By the second landing, I was carrying most of his weight. By the ground floor, my lungs felt like wet sand. A firefighter met us at the window, and we got Douglas out 12 seconds before the floor above us let go. I spent 2 days in the hospital with smoke inhalation. My chief cited me for going in without proper gear and without authorization. He was right to. I also received a commendation, which felt like being given a ribbon for jaywalking. I didn't talk about it much after that, because it was over, and talking about it wouldn't change anything about what had happened, and there were other calls to take. Douglas Avery, I later learned, was a junior partner at an accounting firm in downtown Dayton. He'd written a letter to the department afterward, then sent a personal note to the precinct that I'd been transferred out of by the time it arrived. Someone filed it. I never saw it. 19 years had passed, and now he was sitting at my daughter's Thanksgiving table, telling my son-in-law things I had never told my own family. After dinner, the dishes were cleared with attention, underneath the politeness that everyone pretended not to notice except Owen, who asked if he could be excused and was gone before anyone answered. Douglas found me on the back porch. I was leaning against the railing with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. He stood beside me without talking for a minute, the way men of a certain age do when they've already said the important things and don't need to dress them up. "I looked for you," he said finally. "I transferred to homicide the following year. By the time I tracked down the precinct, they said you'd moved units." He exhaled slowly. "I wanted to say thank you. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to." He turned to look at me directly. "I wanted to." We stood there in the cold for a moment. Somewhere down the street, someone was burning wood in a fireplace. You could smell it faintly. "How long has that been going on?" Douglas asked, nodding back toward the house. I shrugged. "Brent's not a bad man. He just doesn't understand certain things." "Like what?" I thought about how to say it simply. Like the difference between what a life looks like from the outside and what it costs from the inside. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should know that I became a CPA because I almost didn't become anything." I looked at him. "After the fire," he said, "I spent about a year not taking my life seriously, going through the motions, telling myself I'd get around to the things that mattered." He paused. "Then one morning I woke up and remembered what it felt like to be on my knees on that floor, and I understood that I was wasting the time someone had risked their own to give me." He pulled something from his coat pocket. A small laminated card, worn soft at the edges. On one side, the department badge seal. On the other, a department identification number I recognized as mine. "Someone at the precinct gave me this when I went looking for you," he said. "Wouldn't give me your home address, which was right, but gave me this. I've kept it a long time." I stared at it. "I built a firm," he said. 12 people, good people. We do pro bono work for veterans and first responders navigating benefits claims. Started it because of that night, because I needed a reason to deserve the morning." I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not a man who manages those moments gracefully. Back inside, the living room had reached an uncomfortable equilibrium. Carol was doing dishes. Brent was on his phone in the study with the door half closed. Owen had fallen asleep on the couch with his shoe still on. Douglas asked Carol quietly if he could address the family before he left. She looked at me. I shrugged once. We gathered in the living room, Brent emerging from the study with the slightly irritated expression of someone interrupted mid-justification. Owen stirred, blinked, and sat up. Carol stood near the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands. Douglas didn't speak like a man making a speech. He spoke the way people speak when they've turned something over long enough that it comes out clear. He told them about the warehouse. He told them about the smoke and the locked office and getting to his knees. He told them what it felt like when the door opened and there was a cop in a wet jacket with no breathing equipment and no backup and no particular reason to be there except that possibly someone was. He told them that he'd spent 19 years carrying a debt he'd never been able to pay. I don't say this to embarrass anyone, he said, looking briefly at Brent. I say it because the man sitting in this room with you has earned more than the word liability. The room was very quiet. Owen looked at me with the complete seriousness that children use when they're committing something to memory. Grandpa, he whispered, you went into a fire? A long time ago, buddy. Were you scared? I thought about that honestly. Yes, but you went anyway. Somebody needed to. He nodded slowly, the way children do when an answer makes sense to them at a level they can't quite explain yet. Brent was looking at a spot on the wall just to the left of my face. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man recalibrating without wanting to show that he's doing it. Carol set down the dish towel. Her eyes were full. Why didn't you ever tell us? She asked quietly. Nothing to tell. I did my job. You were in the hospital for 2 days. That part I probably could have mentioned. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else entirely. Later, after Douglas had gone home and Owen had been carried to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with Carol while she made chamomile tea she wasn't going to drink. The house had gone quiet the way houses go after holidays. Heavier, more honest. He doesn't know what to say to you, Carol said. She meant Brent. He doesn't have to say anything. He should. She wrapped both hands around her mug. He was wrong. I looked at the table. Your husband loves you. He loves Owen. He's worked hard to build what you have. Those aren't small things. None of that excuses what he said. No, I agreed. It doesn't, but it makes him human. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. Mom used to say you were made of some material that didn't show damage the same way regular people do. She looked up. I used to think that was a compliment. I waited. Now I think she meant she was worried about you. Carol's voice was very careful. Because you don't show it doesn't mean you don't feel it. I sat with that a while. I got good at carrying things quietly, I said finally. That's what the job required. After enough years, you stop knowing how to put things down. What things? I thought about the calls I'd never described to her, the families I'd notified, the ones that stayed with you not because of what happened, but because of the particular way a sound left a person's body when you told them. I thought about the night I sat in a gas station parking lot for 40 minutes before driving home, because the scene I'd just left had a child's shoe next to the curb, and I needed 40 minutes before I could come home to my own family. I thought about Elaine, and the years we spent not talking about how tired we both were, because talking about it would have made it more real. Things, I said simply. Carol reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She'd inherited her mother's understanding that sometimes the right response is just a hand on the table. The following Sunday, Brent asked me to help him replace the kitchen faucet. He said the hardware store guy had given him the wrong fitting twice, and he needed someone with patience for that kind of thing. It was the closest he was going to come, for a while, to an apology. I said I'd take a look. We spent about an hour under the sink, which is the kind of work that requires you to talk about something else the whole time, so you don't think about how uncomfortable you are. Brent talked about a commercial property deal he was trying to close. I asked questions I mostly understood. At one point, he handed me a wrench without being asked, which meant he'd been paying attention. When we finished, he leaned against the counter and said, without looking directly at me, I didn't know about the fire. No reason you would have. Carol didn't either. No. He was quiet for a moment. You don't talk about that stuff much. No. He nodded slowly. My grandfather was a fireman, he said, in Pittsburgh. He never talked about it either. He paused. My dad said he used to have nightmares, but at family stuff he was just quiet. We all thought he was just kind of checked out. He didn't say anything else after that, but he didn't need to. I understood what he was trying to tell me in the way that men who haven't practiced telling each other things try to tell each other things. 3 weeks later, Douglas called me. Said his firm was hosting a luncheon for first responders navigating VA and pension claims. The kind of paperwork jungle that swallows people whole when they're already exhausted. He asked if I'd be willing to come, meet some of the people they helped, maybe talk to a few of the younger officers about what benefits actually looked like after 30 years. I almost declined. I'd been declining things for 2 years. Instead, I said yes. The luncheon was at a community center near uptown Charlotte. Round tables, fluorescent lights, bad coffee, and pump-top carafes. Exactly my kind of American gathering. There were maybe 40 people, retired cops, firefighters, 2 Army veterans who'd done their time and come home to find the paperwork was its own second deployment. Younger officers who looked like I must have looked at 30. Capable and privately exhausted and pretending they had more figured out than they did. Douglas introduced me briefly, nothing dramatic, just explained how we'd met. Afterward, a woman named Cheryl sat down next to me. Retired dispatch supervisor, 30 years. She said she'd been fighting a disability classification for 18 months because of hearing loss. Nobody at the department had documented properly, even though every dispatcher in her unit had it. I spent an hour with her going through what she had. Told her which forms needed to proceed which. Told her who to call and in what order and what to say when she called. Before she left, she said, "I've been at this alone for so long. I forgot you could just ask somebody." I thought about that driving home. I thought about all the years I'd spent being the person you didn't need to check on because I seemed fine. The person who showed up and did the work and went home quietly. The person my own daughter hadn't known well enough to know about a fire. Men from my generation were good at being needed and bad at saying so. We were also sometimes bad at letting anyone see what it cost. A month after the luncheon, Carol came by my apartment on a Saturday morning with Owen and a bag of groceries. She said she was making soup. I said she didn't have to. She said she knew. She found the box while she was looking for a stock pot. Top shelf of the hall closet, behind the extra blankets. Old shoebox, held together with a rubber band. She brought it to the kitchen table without asking. Inside, the commendation letter from 2004. A citation for valor from 2009, a domestic situation that had gone sideways and almost worse before it didn't. A folded newspaper clipping from 2013. A missing girl recovered after 72 hours. My name mentioned in the 4th paragraph. A photograph of my precinct, Christmas 1997. The whole unit standing in front of the building in paper hats, looking slightly embarrassed. And at the bottom, a card in Elaine's handwriting. No envelope. Just a plain notacard. On the front she'd written, "For the days he doesn't believe it mattered." Inside, in her careful school teacher script, "It mattered. Every single day it mattered. And so do you." I don't know when she wrote it. I don't know if she meant for me to find it immediately or eventually, or after she was gone. Carol held it for a long time without saying anything. Owen looked at the commendation letter with great seriousness and then asked if I had a badge. I got it from the bedroom. He held it with both hands like it weighed more than it did. "Grandpa," he said, "were you the police for a really long time?" 31 years. He thought about this. "Was it hard? Sometimes? But you kept doing it." He handed the badge back carefully. "That's what my teacher calls perseverance," he said, with the particular satisfaction of someone deploying a new word correctly. Carol laughed. Genuinely, the way she laughed when she was a kid. And for a second, I could see her mother in her face so clearly it almost took my breath away. Brent joined us for dinner that evening. He'd driven over separately, said he had some work to finish first, showed up just as Carol was ladling soup. He sat next to Owen. At one point during dinner, he leaned over and said something quietly to Owen. And Owen nodded seriously, and then looked at me and gave me a thumbs up, for reasons I didn't fully understand, but appreciated. After dinner, Brent helped me carry dishes to the kitchen. At the sink, he said, "Douglas Avery called me." I kept rinsing dishes. "Did he?" Said, "His firm is looking for someone to help liaise with local precincts for their first responder program. Someone with credibility. Someone the officers would actually talk to." He paused. He asked if I thought you'd be interested. I set a bowl in the drying rack. Said he'd been meaning to call you directly, but he thought it might be better coming from family first. I looked out the small window above the sink. The sky had gone the particular shade of purple it goes just after the last of the light leaves. "What do you think?" I asked. Brent was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected from him, and maybe he hadn't expected it either. "I think," he said slowly, "that I didn't understand what it meant to spend 31 years doing something hard and never ask for anything back." He kept his eyes on the dishes. "I'm still not sure I understand it, honestly, but I think I want to." We finished the dishes without saying much else. Some conversations don't need a destination. They just need to start. 2 months later, I drove to Charlotte Uptown on a Wednesday morning and met Douglas at his office, 11th floor, glass walls, a view of the skyline that was better than anything I'd ever had in my working life. He introduced me to his team, young people mostly, sharp and careful. One of them, a woman named Teresa who couldn't have been more than 30, had volunteered 20 hours a week for 3 years helping veterans navigate disability appeals while working full-time. She asked me what the biggest obstacle was, from my experience, when it came to first responders getting the support they needed. I thought about Cheryl and her 18-month fight over hearing loss nobody had documented. I thought about the night shift differential and the pharmacy that stayed open late. I thought about how long I'd been an expert at carrying things quietly. "Pride," I said. "Most of them have spent their whole careers being the person other people call. Becoming the person who calls for help requires a completely different muscle. A lot of them never built it." Teresa nodded like she already knew that, but needed to hear it said plainly. "What changed it for you?" she asked. I thought about that honestly. "A man showed up at a dinner table," I said, and told some people the truth about me before I could stop him." She smiled. "Good man, yes," I agreed. "He is." That spring, Owen's school had an assembly for community helpers. Teachers, nurses, firefighters. Owen had asked his teacher if his grandfather could come, explained that his grandfather had been a police detective for a very long time and had also gone into a burning building, which the teacher apparently found sufficiently impressive. I almost said no. Assemblies with folding chairs and mediocre acoustics were generally Elaine's department. But Owen gave me the same look grandsons give grandfathers when they already know you're going to say yes. So I went. Carol came. Brent took a half day and met us there, which I noticed without remarking on it. I sat in the gymnasium next to Douglas, who had also been invited, apparently, for reasons that became clear. When the principal announced he was going to share a story about community and the ways strangers can change each other's lives, Douglas told the story plainly. No drama, no performance. The warehouse, the smoke, the door opening, the 19 years, the laminated card. Then he pointed at me. I sat up straight in a plastic folding chair while fourth graders stared. One of them raised her hand and asked me if fire was hot. I said yes, fire was indeed hot. She seemed satisfied. Owen was sitting in the front row with his class. When our eyes met, he didn't wave or bounce or make faces the way kids do. He just looked at me steadily with an expression I recognized, because I'd seen it on his grandmother's face 100 times. It was the look of someone deciding to pay attention. That look, I've learned, is the only inheritance that really lasts. Not money, not property, not whatever arrangements get made at the end of things. Just the quality of attention we give each other while there's still time to give it. After the assembly, walking out through the gymnasium with the smell of chalk dust and somebody's spilled juice box in the air, Owen slid his hand into mine. "Grandpa," he said, "I want to be something useful when I grow up." I looked down at him. "What does useful mean?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. "The way you think about questions from children, which is the same way you should think about every question, which is to say, honestly and without shortcuts." "It means," I said, "doing the work that needs doing, even when it costs you something, and not making people guess how much you cared." He considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old making a filing decision. "Okay," he said finally. "I can do that." "Yeah," I said, "I think you can." And if this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you before you had the words to ask, someone who went quiet instead of complaining, someone whose sacrifice you learned about secondhand or too late, I hope you'll find a way to let them know it wasn't invisible. Because the people who spend their lives making sure others feel safe are often the last ones to feel seen themselves. And sometimes all it takes is one ordinary dinner, one unexpected truth spoken across the table, to remind a man that the life he spent carefully was worth something after all.